Well, thank you, Daniel, for that great introduction, and also thank you to MESDA and specifically April in particular for putting together this conference and for inviting me to be a part of it. My task today, following Alexandra and Lisa's great introductions this morning, and thank you, Lisa, for setting me up perfectly for this next stage, is to pull the Quakers down the Great Wagon Road from Philadelphia into the southern context, and specifically into that of the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. As Daniel said, my interest goes way back, but recently this research started when I began researching this tall case clock in our collection at the museum. In addition to being signed on the dial right here by the clockmaker goldsmith Chanley, the case is signed no less than 3 times in the hood by its casemaker, Jonathan Ross. This is the most legible of those 3 signatures, with Jonathan Ross and the date 1787 here, but hopefully you can see a little bit of that, another one a little more faded. The clock's earliest history places it at this house, Circle Hill, the Pigeon family seat in what is now Clark County, Virginia, just east of Winchester. And we'll talk a little bit more about this clock and its casemaker a little later, but I wanted to show it to you right off the bat as an example of the preservationist mindset that could be found amongst the Valley's 20th century Quaker population that has really made this study possible today. As I hope this great picture attests from 1934, Valley friends like the Pigeon family remained proud of their heritage long after the zenith of Quaker culture in our area, and that pride extended to their family heirlooms. Members of the Pigeon family recognized and preserved not only pieces like the clock, but also this really spectacular applique quilt made by one of the clock's later owners, Sarah Chanley Pigeon, which is now in the Colonial Williamsburg collection. So a couple objects like those preserved by the Pigeons with the digitization of meticulously kept records that Alexandra showed us this morning of meeting records, meeting minutes, marriage certificates, and other records through online platforms like Ancestry.com, which allow us to track the movement of furniture makers like Jonathan Ross down to the month that they're moving from place to place instead of the year. And there has never been a better time to reevaluate the Quaker impact on the Shenandoah Valley and its decorative arts. Quakers could be found the length of the Shenandoah Valley in small pockets by the last quarter of the 18th century, but for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to be focusing on the heart of Quaker culture in the northern end of the valley in what is now Frederick, Clark, and Warren counties in Virginia and Berkeley County in West Virginia. The concept for the Quaker settlement in the valley actually originated where we just were in Chester County with 2 Pennsylvania friends, Alexander Ross of East Nottingham Meeting and Morgan Bryan, an Irishman but Dutch-born of New Garden Meeting. Ross and Bryan petitioned the Virginia Council in October 1730 for 100,000 acres in what was then Orange County, Virginia, and became Frederick County. Their requests fit very well with Lieutenant Governor William Gooch's plans for the Shenandoah Valley. He envisioned a populated valley as a buffer between Tidewater, Virginia interests and those perceived threats across the Appalachian Mountains from the French and their Indian allies, which culminated in the 7 Years' War. The Governor's Council approved that request with the stipulation that Ross and Bryan remained there for at least 2 years, and they settled 100 families on the land at least. But in actuality, the pair settled closer to 70 families near the present Frederick and Berkeley County border, west of Opequon Creek and north of present-day Winchester. And as a focal point and as a reference point for this entire talk, Winchester will be our anchor here outlined in that white box. The majority of these families originated in Chester County, but they were joined by settlers from Tidewater, Virginia, down near where the Prime Jefferson map that Robert showed us yesterday, Maryland, Delaware, southern New Jersey, and points further north in New England and the broader Atlantic world. Brian actually established his seat on Mill Creek near what is today Gerrardstown, West Virginia, while Alexander Ross acquired over 2,300 acres centered on a limestone spring a few miles to the south. Ross built his stone home, which was first called Ross's Spring and still stands, as you can see here, but it was renamed Waverly when it was actually purchased by a member of the Washington family in 1826, and it's still an operating farm today. With the establishment of so many Quaker families came the need for a meeting for worship, and Ross again took the initiative and petitioned the East Nottingham monthly meeting in Chester County to authorize a Virginia meeting in May 1734, which was granted. Ross carved a 10-acre plot from his own land grant for a meeting house and an adjoining cemetery. So that first meeting house was a simple log structure. It burned in 1759 and was replaced starting in 1759 with this building. And the cemetery has in fact never moved, and it still contains some of the earliest graves anywhere in the county, and they're very simply marked in the Quaker manner, like this one, with just the initials and a date. Hopewell was authorized as a monthly meeting the year after its founding in 1735, meaning it could conduct its own business, and it also came to supervise the many smaller preparative meetings that became so numerous, like these two, Back Creek and Upper Ridge on Apple Pie Ridge, that they came to encircle the seat at Winchester. The seat at Winchester right here in the center. So Hopewell's up here, and these meetings, these smaller meetings, are all around the ridges in Frederick County. In becoming a monthly meeting, Hopewell also cemented its place in that hierarchical system that Robert first laid out for us yesterday, and which has been expanded by Alexandra and Lisa this morning. And that system regulated and reinforced the society's tenets amongst its members, as we've seen. Hopewell, after 1735, answered first to the quarterly meeting at East Nottingham. It was later just referred to as Nottingham meeting, and I might use that back and forth throughout this talk. But ultimately, to the yearly meeting in Philadelphia, which connected Virginia Friends to the heart of Quaker culture and the largest style center in the mainland British colonies. A second wave of migration to the Northern Valley came in the mid-1730s in the form of Scotch-Irish Quaker and Presbyterian families coming from central New Jersey. They were known as the Jersey Settlement, and these 25-odd families settled in western Frederick County along Back Creek right at the foot of Great North Mountain. By 1745, most had moved on to settle the Yadkin River Valley right here in Piedmont, North Carolina. So we're over here in Salem, and then a little bit to the left is that valley. And they were led by Morgan Bryan, who helped bring the Quakers to Virginia. He was a very restless sort, but eventually ended up in North Carolina, and there he died. But some families stayed in Frederick County, and the presence of names like Anderson, Branson, Price, and Pancoast meant that the Jersey settlers probably also contributed their own tastes to the valley's growing decorative vocabulary. So for Quakers coming to Virginia, the advantage was not so much in being able to freely practice their religion. As Alexandra laid out for us this morning, William Penn founded Pennsylvania for that very reason. Instead, the advantage was the opportunity to acquire large tracts of cheap and fertile land that could be parceled out into smaller farms as sons and daughters grew up and they established their own families. Virginia Quakers favored choice land that was bisected by streams like Opequon Creek in the northwest part of the county, and planned settlement transformed into substantial wealth through saw and grist milling and also grain farming. As I mentioned to a few of you yesterday in the MESDA galleries, some of the wheat that was grown and milled in the valley reached as far away as Lisbon, Portugal, through Quaker kinship-based merchant networks in places like Alexandria, that very large port before the Revolution. From the Quaker viewpoint, as we've heard, material goods like furniture acquired as the result of hard work and honest business could be viewed as signs of God's favor and someone's moral standing. A good example of this is Isaac Parkins Sr. He was born in 1697 in Newcastle County, Delaware, but he had already begun his migration, and by the time he came to the Shenandoah Valley, he was living in Kent County, Maryland. He patented over 1,400 acres across 3 tracts southwest of present-day Winchester in 1735. And across those 3 tracts, he built a sawmill, 2 flour mills, believed by some local historians to be the earliest erected in the county. And on one of those tracts, he also built his home, Friendly Grove, which you can see in the back of the photograph here. Friendly Grove is thought to be the site of the earliest Quaker marriage in the entire Shenandoah Valley. Unfortunately, Friendly Grove fell into disrepair and was torn down in 1947, but a few images of it survive. According to one oral history, actually this comes from my grandmother who was in the house, Friendly Grove was a hall parlor plan, like the one down here, with a staircase tucked into one corner of the hall. The house surprisingly only had one fireplace, and you can actually see it on the right-hand side of the house in the more private parlor. A hall parlor plan fit well with the Isaac Parkins's Welsh heritage, but it was also actively promoted by William Penn in Pennsylvania as a layout ideal for Quaker families. And from this seat at Friendly Grove, Parkins served in several positions during his lifetime, and some of those went against Quaker doctrines. He was a justice for Frederick County, a burgess in Williamsburg, a vestryman for Frederick Parish in the Anglican Church, and most egregious for a member of the Society of Friends, he was a captain of the militia. But in some of those records, everyone who is serving in his company, they're also Quakers, and they're being fined for not attending the muster. So I think he might have looked out for them a little bit. And for that reason, because he is a wealthy and prominent Quaker, he was probably afforded a little leniency for his actions. A few records from Frederick County show that he used his position to assist Quakers that were accused of dissidence against the Anglican Church. And on a handful of occasions, he even secured the release of Quakers who were who were imprisoned for conscience sake, for either not swearing an oath or not paying a fine, something like that. By the time Parkins died in 1774, his estate reflected that of many prominent farmers in the valley. In addition to his very vast land holdings, he also owned comfort items like pewter, silver, and Delftware, and he also owned a few pieces of furniture, including a looking glass, a case of drawers, a clock, a desk, a couch, which might also be a daybed, and 5 tables. And as the story with many Quaker families in the valley, his subsequent generations built on his success. Around 1799, his granddaughter, Hannah Parkins, and her husband built the core of this house, Willow Lawn, which was a stone's throw from the Friendly Grove site. Willow Lawn was one of the most substantial homes in Frederick County at the time that it was built, and it continued to expand through to the 1830s. I'm very sad to say that unfortunately it too was torn down in the mid-20th century. None of the furniture listed in Parkins's inventory is directly known, but I suspect, and this is still just a theory at this point, that he had ties to what might be the earliest piece of furniture with a Frederick County history. And to set us up for that, Isaac's daughter, Rachel Parkins, different than the granddaughter, married Isaac Hollingsworth around 1748. And a few years later, in 1754, they built this house, Abram's Delight. And in fact, it still has the date stone hopefully you can see the I and the R in 1754 up there in the gable end. The house is now the oldest standing home in Winchester, but when it was first built, it was way outside of the town's boundaries. Abrams Delight was continually occupied by the Hollingsworth family through to Annie Hollingsworth here, the last family member to live there. After her death in 1930, the property passed to several cousins, who in turn sold it to the city of Winchester in 1943. 2 years later, the city chose to sell the contents of the house before turning it over to the Winchester-Frederick County Historical Society, who owns it today, intending for the society to open it as a historic house museum. And I hope the irony is not lost there. The sale chronicled generations worth of Hollingsworth family objects. One of the most high-selling pieces was this object that in the sale was described as a 17th century gate leg table in walnut. Some saint went through and recorded everything that sold, how much it sold for, and who bought it, which has been great. And so we know that this sold for $425. Keep in mind, this is just a couple of months after World War II ended. And it sold only behind a high chest of drawers, which we'll see in just a minute, and what was probably a dated 1775 secretary and bookcase. And we would not have an image of this table at all except for the efforts of Dr. Alfred Hinkle, who was an early antiquarian in the Valley, and he went around photographing objects owned by old Valley families in the early 1900s. So when I first began researching this table, I tried to place it in a Delaware Valley context with so many of the families coming from the Mid-Atlantic, but I was very surprised to find that the table's turnings are actually evocative of examples made in early 18th century eastern Massachusetts. And a pilgrim table in colonial backcountry Virginia would be very unusual, except maybe for the fact that the Parkins family has New England roots. The earliest traceable member of the family, Isaac Perkins with an E up here at the top, probably for whom the Virginia Isaac was named, migrated from Wales first to Ipswich, Massachusetts up here sometime in the 1630s. The persecution from Puritans forced the family to retreat up to Hampton, New Hampshire. And Isaac's son, Ebenezer, continued the migration south sometime after his father's death in 1685, moving to Brandywine Hundred in what's now Newcastle County, Delaware. Ebenezer's will that's dated 1703 identifies him as late of New England, and he left his real estate to his youngest sons, Ebenezer Jr. and our Isaac, at which point the name changes to Parkins with an A. Isaac sold his part of his inheritance in preparation to for his move to Virginia. And I will admit that the table is probably slightly later than the Parkins' move south. It probably dates to about 1715 to 1730. But I am intrigued with the possibility, however slim it might be, that it could have filtered down to Rachel Parkins at Abrams Delight from either a direct or a collateral line. And I share this table with you for two reasons. First, I hope that giving it a little bit of exposure will help bring it to light. We don't know where it is, and so we can learn a little more about it, whatever its story might be. And the second is for its possible implications. If this table is indeed a Parkins family piece, it would connect Virginia's Quakers to a network that spanned the length of Britain's North American colonies. A handful of other pieces have returned to Abrams Delight over the years, including that high chest of drawers, the single highest selling piece in the sale, and the cherry birdcage candle stand that you can see on the right. And very recently, also this corner cupboard that came back to the family, came back to the Historical Society just a couple of months ago. The cupboard's interior ochre paint is largely gone from the upper shelves. But if you look at it from underneath, it still is very much preserved. And so hopefully you can see it right here in these three shelves. And I just wanted to show this cupboard to highlight how much more work needs to be done on the objects that came from Abram's Delight. But in terms of identifiable Quaker woodworkers, they came with the first wave of migrations in the 1730s. And in fact, my research as it is now suggests that Quakers were the single largest group of furniture makers in at least Frederick County, if not for the entire northern Shenandoah Valley. I guess I should preface that. Of the approximately 104 documented joiners, carpenters, cabinet makers, and other allied tradesmen working in old Frederick County before 1775, keep in mind that this includes parts of present-day Virginia and West Virginia. About 27% can be directly identified in Quaker records. Another 17% have surnames that are very common to Quaker families in the area. They might represent lapsed Quakers or ones that just don't appear in the records. And another the remaining 56% represent lesser percentages of ethnic groups and religious groups that made Frederick County the most ethnically diverse in the Shenandoah Valley, like English Anglicans, Scots and Scotch-Irish Presbyterians, German-speaking Lutherans and Reformed, and also free and enslaved Africans. But when taken in total, Quakers possibly made up somewhere between 1/3 and a little less than 1/2 of the settlers responsible for furniture making, pieces that were intended for friends and for non-friends alike. So the earliest documented Quaker craftsman in the Northern Valley is actually the same Alexander Ross that I mentioned at the beginning. According to family tradition, he was born in Scotland around 1682, and around 11 years old, he was orphaned and brought to America in 1693 as an indentured servant. Chester County records reveal that he was brought to the colonies and assigned to Caleb Pusey, an English last maker. And when Ross was brought here, he probably stayed at this home, Pusey's home in what is now Upland Township. Pusey was a contemporary of William Penn's, and his house is now the second oldest English yeoman-style house in Pennsylvania. So Ross served his apprenticeship with Pusey until the age of 21, the standard age, until about 1703, when he pursued the joiner's trade. And records from Chester County over the next few decades identify him as a joiner, and he made his way out to West Nottingham Township before he made the move to Virginia. And this is just another view of the interior of that Caleb Pusey house. So Robert often likes to say that you don't know a craftsman until you can locate his home, his church, and the creek on which he lived. And I can tell you that it doesn't get any easier than with Alexander Ross. So as I mentioned earlier, Ross established his home, Ross's Spring, which is the white circle on the map, and then he carved the site for Hopewell Meeting House, the red circle. Both of those were near Clearbrook Run, near what's now the West Virginia border. And to further emphasize how close these two structures are, this photograph, I took this photograph from the back door of Hopewell Meeting House. And can you see that little stone structure through the trees? That is the Ross family homestead. But despite being such an early presence and an important figure, almost nothing can be attributed to Ross. He is a strong candidate to have furnished the original Hopewell Meeting, or at least aided in its construction, before it burned in 1757. And Hopewell's pre-1759 records, unfortunately, are not available to check against, but not because they were burned in that first fire. They were saved from the fire and entrusted to Hopewell's third clerk of meeting, William Jolliffe Jr., who is my direct ancestor. Jolliffe then took them to his clapboard home called the Red House for its bright red paint. And around the time that this building began construction, Jolliffe's house burned to the ground, along with every record pre-1759 from Hopewell. So in some ways, I am making up for my family's sins by researching this topic. The tasks of 18th century joiners often extended to architectural woodwork, which leads us to the most likely example of Alexander Ross's work. In 1739, Ross's brother-in-law, Arthur Barrett of Chester County, who was a tailor by trade, brought his family to join the Quaker settlements in Virginia. He settled on Apple Pie Ridge, which Alexandra showed us a little bit earlier images of, south of Hopewell, where he built his house right here with an early 1738 core and later additions. This house was torn down in the 1990s. But in good Quaker fashion, Barrett's sons began building their own homes nearby in the 1740s, including this house began by his son James around 1745. Much of the original woodwork survives in the earlier sections of the house, including these two paneled doors that are on the first floor, and there are several more on the upper levels. The arched and beveled tombstone tops that you can see here are a characteristic common to architecture and furniture in the Nottingham area of Chester County, where Ross lived before he came to Virginia. And one of the best comparisons that I can offer you is this line and berry inlaid double dome top desk and bookcase made for the Montgomery family of Chester County, which Lisa and Wendy Cooper included in the Paint Pattern and People exhibition a few years ago. So the allusions to Nottingham traditions and the Barrett-Ross connection suggest to me that Ross made the Barrett House doors, if not most of the interior woodwork. And I don't want to spend too much time on the Barrett House, but it really is a fascinating study of the evolution of a Quaker home in the valley. So sometime in the house's history, we see the additions of these little under-window drawers. This one has bale pulls, but in a couple other places in the house, there are other drawers that are flush and are more or less secret drawers underneath. And we also have the addition of some fireplace surrounds that match local casework in later decades. So Alexander Ross died in 1748. He was one of many who suffered in an epidemic that tore through the Hopewell community that year. It ultimately took not only him, but also his wife, several sons, a son-in-law, and many neighbors. So in that mayhem, Ross's inventory was unfortunately not taken, or at least it doesn't survive. But those of his son, John Ross, who was probably a carpenter, and his son-in-law, John Littler, were taken. And they offer us the final glimpse into what Alexander and maybe his son John might have made. The son-in-law, John Littler, whose inventory is here, owned a clothes press, chairs, and a desk, among other things. And both Littler and John Ross owned a chest with drawers under it. And this is a bit of supposition, but Lisa just showed this chest that's now possibly a Bailey piece. And I speculate that chest with drawers under it might have looked something like this piece made for Robert and Ann Lamborn of Chester County just 2 years before Alexander Ross died in Virginia. So generations of the Ross family were lost with the 1748 epidemic, but their woodworking tradition continued through to the next century with Alexander's grandson, Jonathan, down here, which brings us back around to the clock that I showed at the beginning of this talk. Jonathan was the child of Alexander's son, John, also possibly a carpenter, and his wife, Lydia Hollingsworth. In a kind of sad twist, Jonathan was born within a couple of months of the death of his father and his grandparents in that epidemic. His now widowed mother, Lydia, remarried to William Jolliffe Jr., who I mentioned earlier, the third clerk of Hopewell. Lydia herself died in 1759 when Jonathan was 11, So he was actually orphaned around the same age that his grandfather was, more or less, which is one of a couple of parallels that we'll see. So most likely he was raised in the household of William Jolliffe Jr. But as his stepson, Jonathan probably did not stand to inherit land according to primogeniture, which may have influenced his decision to pursue a trade. We don't know who Ross's master in Virginia was, but with the help of the MESDA Craftsmen database, we can narrow it down to about 6 or so Quaker carpenters and joiners living in proximity to Hopewell in the 1760s. We know very little else about Jonathan Ross until October 1767, when at around 19 or 20 years old, he petitioned Hopewell to transfer his membership to Nottingham Monthly Meeting in Chester County. So he's making the exact opposite migration that his grandfather made a couple of generations earlier, seeking his fortune as a journeyman woodworker. When he moved to Nottingham, he might have stayed with his aunt Lydia Ross and her husband John Day, possibly in this oldest section of the Day House that now still stands in Cecil County, Maryland. Ross worked in an unidentified Nottingham area shop for the next 7 years, but he moved back to Virginia in late 1775 or early 1776. Coming with him for the first time was goldsmith Chanley, the clockmaker responsible for the works of the Pigeon Walker family clock and many surviving other clocks from the Northern Valley. Chanley is about as close to Quaker craftsman royalty as you could possibly wish to be. His great-grandfather, Abel Cotty of Philadelphia, was America's first clockmaker, and that is a tradition that carried to Goldsmith's grandfather and his father, Benjamin Chanley Sr. and Jr. Today, Chanley might be best known for the clocks that he learned to make while growing up in Nottingham from his father. But later in his career, upon moving to Winchester, he also made complex surveying and mathematical instruments like some of these. So that connection led much later, a little over a decade later, to them collaborating on the Circle Hill clock that we saw earlier, after they'd been established in Virginia for quite a bit. The clock's earliest documented owners, Isaac Pigeon and Rachel Walker, purchased the Circle Hill house in 1812, just after their marriage. So remember that this clock has that 1787 date in the hood, which means that one of them must have brought it to the marriage at Circle Hill, but we don't quite know which one yet. More importantly, the Pigeon Walker clock is the earliest example we have of Ross imprinting the style of joinery that he learned in Nottingham onto Virginia-made furniture. Wendy Cooper and Mark Anderson define the characteristics of the Nottingham area pieces in their great 2011 article in American Furniture, and I'd encourage you to take a look at that if you haven't already seen it. I actually think there might be some copies out for sale in the lobby. But for those features that apply to our clock at the museum, they include the spiraled rosettes down here, in some cases unfluted quarter columns, and these tiny, tiny little squat OG bracket feet, and also I should say the applied keystones up here in the tympanum. One of the closest related Pennsylvania pieces that I can show you is this clock with a silvered brass dial signed by Goldsmith Chanley's father, Benjamin. And in fact, I actually suspect this clock might be an example of Ross's work while he was still living in Pennsylvania. And I'm trying to track it down. It's probably somewhere in New England. And if anyone has seen it, I'd love to know about it. In 1795, Ross transferred his membership from Hopewell to Crooked Run Meeting south of Winchester in what is now present-day Warren County, Virginia. And that move matches Ross's only other signed piece, this dated 1805 chest of drawers. And it too speaks to the transfer of Pennsylvania styles to the valley. MESDA researchers documented it in the house of a doctor in Luray, Virginia, which is about 30 miles south of Crooked Run Meeting House. And unlike the smooth quarter columns we saw, you can see that this just has a chamfered corner with lamb's tongues at the top and the bottom. And while this could possibly be a tall chest missing its base molding and its original feet, I would like to speculate that it could also be the upper section of a chest on frame, a form which Ross would have encountered in Chester County. So like many friends after the Revolution, Jonathan Ross's story ended outside of the Society of Friends that was such an important part of his family's legacy. In April 1809, he presented a certificate of removal to Alexandria Monthly Meeting in Alexandria, Virginia. And within a few years, he ran afoul of Quaker practices. He probably hired a substitute to fulfill his militia service in October 1813. And by the end of that year, he had been disowned by the society. He chose not to remain in Virginia after his disownment. He and his family picked up and moved to Champaign County, Ohio, where he died around 1832, and this is his grave marker there. In being disowned, Ross fell subject to the yearly meeting's attempts to better codify and enforce misconduct amongst friends. And as we've heard from a couple different speakers, those offenses could range from military service, which went against Quaker doctrines of pacifism, but also such trivial things as attending a Quaker outside of the Quaker sect. So Ross was one of several Quakers that we've heard about today whose differing opinions about worldliness and the meeting's role in personal life led to a break from society, the society. And these same differences, coupled with theological shifts, contributed to the much wider Orthodox Hicksite schism that rocked the Quaker world in 1827 and 28. So while the Rosses were the earliest multi-generational woodworking family in the valley, they were not the largest. And that title actually falls to another family, the Scotch-Irish Fawcett family of southwestern Frederick County. The Fawcetts produced at least 4 generations of furniture makers, starting up here with Thomas here at the top. And the variety of forms that they made together with those generations make this an excellent case study. Don't worry about memorizing this slide. We're going to come back to it a few times. So Thomas is the earliest documented maker from the family. According to tradition, he was born in Shankill Parish in County Armagh, Ireland, in the last quarter of the 17th century. And that first mention of him as a Quaker is as a member of Grange Meeting in County Tyrone in 1708, which you can see here. That same year, Thomas married Lydia Boys of Ballanderry Meeting in the next county over. The couple presented a certificate of removal from Ballanderry to Chester Monthly Meeting in Pennsylvania in November 1736, along with their 3 sons, Thomas Jr., John, and Richard, 2 of whom became woodworkers. While living in Pennsylvania, Thomas and his family probably attended Springfield Monthly Meeting in what is now Delaware County, just west of Philadelphia. Thomas led the family's migration to the valley in the spring of 1743. Where exactly they settled, we don't quite know. Most likely they squatted on land southwest of Winchester at what is present-day Fawcett Gap at the foot of Little North Mountain. And this image is looking west through Fawcett Gap with the Appalachian Mountains in the background. That land did not formally enter their hands until the 1750s with patents issued by Thomas Lord Fairfax. But by the 1760s and 1770s, they found themselves at an important juncture in the county. The east-west road leading through Fawcett Gap connected Winchester and Stevensburg to Isaac Zane, who's also a Quaker, his first incarnation of Marlborough furnace. And the constant need to bring in raw materials and transport out finished products like stoveplates ensured that the roads at Fawcett Gap were some of the best in the region before the Revolution. Thomas died in early 1747, and in his estate were a variety of tools, including a set of turning tools for chair making. Only one possible object by Thomas survives. In June 1746, the Frederick County Clerk James Wood contracted with Fawcett for a dozen chairs to be used by the court. He received payment for those chairs a few months later in November at a cost of £1 7 shillings. In this armchair, in our collection at the MSV with a Wood family provenance, might be one from that commission that the Wood family kept. For anyone who may not be familiar, our museum benefactor, Julian Woodglass Jr., who's up there at the top left, was a direct descendant of James Wood, who was the county clerk, but also the founder of Winchester. In this image at the bottom right shows the chair, probably in the 1960s at Glen Burnie, the Wood family home that Julian lived in until his death, and the chair was relegated up to the attic. Thomas, as the maker, is slightly possible, but I really think more likely it might be the work of his youngest son, Richard. Richard presumably learned chair making from his father. The MESDA Craftsmen database also identifies him as a wheelwright, which speaks to his proficiency at turning. And we are really astoundingly lucky to have documentation to prove that Richard made chairs for the James Wood family. So this is the first of a couple of receipts in Wood's loose papers at the Stuart Bell Archives in Winchester, which is dated February 1743, and it identifies 14 chairs made at a cost of a little over £3. Another loose receipt issued 2 years later shows that he paid 30 shillings for unidentified work done, but that was probably also turning. But the best documentation comes from two entries in Wood's surviving ledger book, which is in our collection. The first entry spans 1749 to 50 and accounts for 4 chairs, a child's chair, and a very important charge for bottoming 6 chairs. And that reference to bottoming is important in that it identifies the chairs the Fawcetts were producing as either rush or split bottom chairs like those you would see in Pennsylvania where he came from. The second entry, a couple of years later in April 1753, paid for a dozen chairs, bottoming chairs, and mending a couple more. The surviving chair could be one of these, or it could also be one that hasn't yet been accounted for. On the larger scale, the Wood family chair documents the movement of southeastern Pennsylvania traditions amongst Quakers that were then adopted to suit the needs and taste of consumers in Virginia, Quakers and non-Quakers alike, as is the case with the Woods. The Wood chair, as you can see here, has 7 graduated and arched slats at the center, which is 1 to 2 more than you usually will see on a Delaware Valley example. In this little void between the seat and the bottommost slat suggests that it might have had a cushion or squab to make it a little more comfortable. Many other features remain almost identical to those on Pennsylvania counterparts. And the most impressive detail is that finely turned front stretcher with the arrow ends. And one of the closest comparisons that I can offer you today is this couch or daybed from the Dietrich American Foundation collection with a history in the Darlington family of Chester County. But on the local level, the influence of chair-making families like the Fawcetts can also be felt into the next century. The chair here on the right has likely never moved from the house that it was made for in Stevens City, a few miles from Fawcett Gap. The 18th century styles have been simplified a bit, but that chair has not quite forgotten that large front stretcher. I'm also very fond of images like these next two that depict the women of Hopewell meeting in a historical reenactment around 1930. So in addition to the quilts and other objects that they brought with them, they also brought chairs from their families, some of which are either in those families or in private collections today. The wood chair has remnants of its original green paint. Hopefully you can see some of it in the cracks and the crevices and the graining here. As this crowd, I'm sure, knows, chair makers frequently painted chairs made of different woods and grain patterns, in this case, maple and ash, to unify the surface. And this image also gives you a good view of the ball finial, which helps us tie this chair to other Fawcett family examples. This walnut cradle, for example, descended directly in Richard's line to the current owner. And it's missing its rockers, but compare the ball finials to that on the chair. The cradle is also completely joined and not dovetailed, like you see some later examples from Quaker families. The only other object currently known that could be the work of the second generation Fawcett's is this stretcher table, which currently resides at Hopewell Meeting House in Clearbrook. This table is a very good cautionary tale. In 1936, Hopewell Meeting celebrated its 200th anniversary with a retrospective written by John Wayland, a local historian, and this is actually my very well-worn copy. He made the mistake of publishing the table and identifying it as that of the original clerk from 1759. And I worked with that for a little while until with the help of some folks at Hopewell, we came to realize that it had nothing to do with the 18th century Hopewell, but was actually gifted to Hopewell sometime between 1900 and 1920 by this woman, Sarah Jane Sally Lupton, later Jolliffe after she married. Sally was a direct descendant of Joseph Lupton Jr., an English Quaker from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, and the likeliest original owner for the table. As we'll see a little bit later, the Luptons are best known for settling Apple Pie Ridge, which we've seen some previews of at the top of this map. But when Joseph settled, he first settled west of Winchester at Round Hill, just down Little North Mountain from Fawcett Gap. When Joseph died, there were two witnesses to his will, Richard Fawcett and his brother, John, who was probably also either a carpenter joiner, and their brother-in-law, Andrew Longacre. A Lupton-Fawcett wedding followed a few years after Joseph's death, and I think that evidence suggests that this could be a Lupton piece made for the Fawcetts. But nevertheless, Wayland still got part of the story right. The table is currently used by Hopewell's meeting clerk to record the minutes and sign marriage certificates today. But without its local history, the table would be almost indistinguishable from the many Delaware Valley examples that also survive. Later generations of Fawcett family members continued the traditions of their forebears with even more complex forms. Richard's son Thomas built this home at Fawcett Gap in 1797, and it remained in his family line well into the 20th century. To furnish it, Thomas down here probably turned to his two cousins, John and another Thomas. You see there's a theme here in the family with names. Both were woodworkers and lived on adjoining tracts. And a couple of pieces survive from that house. This tall case clock and the clothes press, both in walnut, both with mortise and tenon construction that's consistent with John and Thomas's background. And finally, the fourth and last generation of Fawcett's are the ones that we know the least about. David down here and his brother Jesse. But like Jonathan Ross, they are important for tracing the movement west. They were disowned and took their families to Illinois and to Ohio, respectively. We are certainly laying the groundwork for with this conference, but the fourth generation Fawcett's help us try and push that forward a little bit. And I would suggest that looking west for the Quakers should be the next step in uncovering their stories. And that point is maybe best made with this clock that descended in a branch of the Fawcett family that moved to Ohio. The case doesn't strike me as something in the Northern Valley, and so it could be something that they had made somewhere west on their way there. But these individual stories are also indicative of larger trends. Quaker movement from the Mid-Atlantic and other areas continued into the early 1800s, but outmigration to areas west of the mountains increasingly outpaced the arrival of newcomers in the last quarter of the 18th century. So, for example, Hopewell lost 142 members, but gained only 95 in the 1790s, and that trend continued downward up through the Civil War. Some Valley Friends left because of persecution that we've heard about, because they were pacifists and they took a non-patriotic stance during the Revolution. Others left because living in Virginia after the war meant that they would live in a slave state, which they could not abide. And they moved to what became free states like Ohio, Indiana, and Illinois, where they could both find newer, cheaper land, but also exercise freedom of conscience. And outmigration coupled with frequent disownments broke down many of the kin-based networks that connected Quaker furniture makers and their consumers. So Crooked Run meeting, for example, the home to Jonathan Ross, was laid down, the Quaker term for closed, in 1807, and it's now the site of Nineveh Presbyterian Church on the road to Front Royal from Winchester. The flight of the Valley Quakers and their decline locally also coincided with the rise of Winchester as a hub of cabinet making along the Great Wagon Road. Winchester was still a small frontier town when George Washington, here on the right, built Fort Loudon to protect the citizens of the valley during the 7 Years' War. But by the 1760s and 1770s, it was well on its way to becoming the largest market town west of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Some Quaker craftsmen integrated into those polyethnic shops that formed in Winchester after the Revolution. There will be a test on this later. But really what I want you to take away, Stephen Way down here at the bottom, a Hopewell Quaker, worked in the shop of John Duffield in 1792. And he's part of a larger school that included Irish Presbyterians like Edward Slater, German and Lutheran Reformed like the Burkhardt brothers and Peter Dagger from York County, Pennsylvania. And furniture consumers like Joseph Lupton's grandson David likewise looked to Winchester for their needs. David Lupton and his wife Mary Hollingsworth completed their home, Cherry Row, which Daniel mentioned in my introduction here, 5 miles north of Winchester. To furnish it, Lupton turned to the Winchester shops that I just mentioned, and he commissioned one of the most impressive surviving suites of local furniture. And I got the chance to share this high chest with many of you yesterday in the MESDA galleries. But Lupton still turned to friends for some of the finishing aspects of Cherry Row. In March 1795, he paid Quaker painter Robert English to paint the house and kitchen. That is all the inside woodwork of various colors, as may be agreeable in a neat workmanlike manner. And amongst other things, he got paid in, I think it was 10 pounds of bacon, and I would love to be paid in bacon. That corner cupboard probably still survives in, actually, in fact, it does still survive in the first floor parlor of the house, taken from architectural resources like William Payne's 1774 Practical Builder. And somehow, if you haven't quite had your fill of Quakers after this conference, next month, the Garden Club of Virginia's Winchester Tours will be focused on the Quaker homes of northern Frederick County. Hopewell Meeting House, the James Barrett House, and Cherry Row will all be on view, in addition to 2 other significant Quaker homes that I didn't have time to discuss today, but which haven't been open to the public for about 2 decades. So I would like to invite you to come see for yourselves the traces of Quaker life and culture that are still discernible on the Valley's landscape today. Thank you very much.